Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Paya wash processed Guatemala from Craft House Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And I think that's the biggest bag of coffee that we've ever reviewed on this channel. But Craft House Coffee, based out of Haywards Heath, England, and this is their first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. And they're a coffee roaster I'd actually never heard of before I saw them being featured in the Coffee Vines 2024 subscription box. And since I was already purchasing the other coffees from that subscription box, it felt like a great opportunity to revisit an English-based coffee roaster, as it has been a bit since we've reviewed any English-based coffee roasters. So we will see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 46. And recipe we went with for this coffee was the Coffee Vines recipe, which was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And I actually like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So this one is also listed as being omni roasted, though truth be told, it's very reminiscent of a lot of other English-based coffees that I've had in the past, and I could definitely see the roast profile being similar to those as well, which is to say that it's kind of some way I would describe as being a slightly less modern version of that American medium light, as it always reminds me of maybe some American coffees I had in the late 2010s and just a lot of English coffees I've had in general. So maybe on that slightly more medium light, maybe on the slightly more developed side of that based off your own coffee preferences. Hopefully that gives you a good idea. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 21, first impression. And we did opt for the V60, and there was a little bit of development, but that was fully expected, but it was backed up nicely by a darker profiled fruit component, including plenty of the listed cherry and berry aspects. There's a slightly jammy stone fruit that was present before the cup did settle, before it offers a slightly savory aspect in line with the listed chamomile. So the notes I had on here were very much in line with my own experiences, especially based off that first try, getting a little bit more depth from this coffee. So for the most part, it was actually a nicer than expected first impression. We move on to day 24 as we opted for the Chemex, and once again, it was very reminiscent of English coffee, and I feel like for people that might have a lot of familiarity with English coffee, there's something that's just a little different about those coffees. Is I feel like oftentimes I can kind of tell that it's English based, so there are some coffee roasters that are the exception to that rule that have started roasting a much more modern, lighter profile to them, but outside of that, a lot of the coffees have this same sort of feel to them, and that's what I was picking up from this one, and that was in line with a slightly more developed profile, with the listed chamomile this time being the most pronounced aspect to it. Slightly darker stone fruit with a darker themed fruit profile yet again. So for the most part, I would say not necessarily quite as good of a second impression, but even then it was still, I would say, a little bit above expectation. Day 27 opted for the April brewer, and the cup feels best at its best right now with more of the classic Guatemalan characteristics, including a slight bit of chocolate, caramel, and nuttiness to it, with the slight bit of the smoky quality present yet again, though maybe not necessarily as pronounced as some of the earlier days. This time the tea-like aspects are the most abundant that they had been up to this point, with the listed notes, including the darker fruit profile, also better defined within this cup. So a very nice April brewer day. Day 30. Opted for the V60 with the Coffee Vines recipe, which honestly would have been my adjustment anyway. I was probably going to lower the temperatures, so this time having a much more precise brew recipe for this coffee with the same sort of adjustments I would have made anyway was really nice, and it did help improve the coffee with more of the developed qualities being toned down, and I think that actually helped offer better definition to the berry aspects, most specifically the cherry within this cup, as it felt very straightforward yet again with those darker berry aspects, but in addition to that, just better overall definition and clarity to those as well. Day 33 opted for the Chemex with the Coffee Vines recipe, and this was by far the best the coffee had been up to this point, as I felt like the definition of a lot of the profiles within this one were the most well-defined to them. Cherry and berry aspects were very clean and very well detected, very easily detected, I should say. Best right-off brew, as there was a little bit of nuttiness within the cool down, but right-off brew, I was saying, okay, you're really feeling a lot of these darker berry aspects within this coffee. And as I'm brewing it on this, well, as I brewed it on this day, I'm definitely experiencing that yet again. We move on to day 36 as we opted for the V60 with our standard recipe, and it wasn't quite as good today with a stronger, more accentuated cherry, but also the robust Colombian berry aspect to it, which I always describe as being reminiscent of maybe a cleaner version of the natural processed Colombian coffees where it has that very strong berry component to it. It continues to remain very straightforward, offering a darker fruit theme to the cup. And then we tried the Chemex with our standard recipe, and I just felt like that one cup we had with the coffee vines recipe was definitely at its best, so I decided to go back to that, as on this day I felt a slight tobacco-like feel in a roasty sense. Outside of that, a bit of what I would describe as being juicy, darker berry fruit, and that's why we opted for the Chemex with the coffee vines recipe on day 42 for the last try. And this was back to being the best it had been, and here on day 46, it's also at its best too, with the darker berry aspects in the cup, present in both a dark cherry and dark berry sense. Nice definition to that, as well as the tea-like aspects of the notes that they have listed on here. I would say significantly better definition to them with this adjustment. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 3 level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. That's maybe one of the better aspects, and one of the better things I have to say about this coffee is that it's very clean. I would say that a lot of the berry profiles within this one are pretty well defined and pretty notable. So for that reason, I could say that even though it might have some things taking away from it, the cleanliness did justify itself at that level 4 mark. Finish level 4. And I think maybe when I was making this tasting wheel, especially right off brew, it had a little bit more of a finish to it. As I'm drinking this, as the cup has cooled down, it doesn't necessarily have a lot of those same lingering aspects to it. So maybe the slightly lower side of level 4, but it's got many of the traditional, we'll just say Guatemalan feel characteristics to it. So that kind of chocolate component, that slight nuttiness to it, and that's something that I continue to pick up within this coffee. So that being there at the level 4, maybe slightly generous, but for the most part, it isn't necessarily the longest lasting coffee. Berry fruit, level 4, and that is easily the most detectable part of this coffee, those darker berry aspects, the darker berry feel to it. So what do they have listed on here? Cherry, blackberry, both of which make a lot of sense. I would say that maybe it's a little bit more of like a, we'll just say blueberry-like aspect for me, mostly because it doesn't have that slight tartness that blackberries can have. But if you want to go with maybe more ripe blackberries, we're just kind of splitting hairs on this one. It's just essentially to say that it is a darker berry theme to it, though the cherry aspect of it, especially at the forefront right off brew, is perhaps the most defined and detectable component for me within this coffee. And then we have a handful of level 3s. We will start with the sweetness level 3. And I do have to say, even though it's a level 3 for the sweetness, I think the sweetness on this one is actually very nice, mostly because it does come in a cleaner fruit sense. And even though it's maybe not the sweetest coffee out there, it's typically the case with coffees that are similar to this. So that, of course, being a, we'll say, standard wash processed Guatemalan coffee that goes along these themes. Level 3 does seem pretty standard, so having it maybe be slightly sweeter than those is a nice part of this one. Acidity level 3, I think that's the profile of this coffee in play, as it wasn't necessarily the brightest coffee, and I'm more than okay with that, mostly because it's not the biggest priority for me in most coffees. We move on to the chocolate level 3. That's going to be plenty of those more traditional Central American characteristics, that and the caramel, both scoring at that level 3 mark, as I felt like they're not listed on here, but I feel like they were definitely on the more abundant side of this coffee, especially on some of the days where it did cool down to a point where I would say they were just a little bit more pronounced. And then a couple more things worth discussing. Savoriness level 3. So the listed chamomile, that tea-like aspect on this one, it actually came in a number of ways, but for the most part, I would say it seemed to follow a lot of the berry fruit components to it. And on certain days, it was even the most pronounced characteristic of this coffee. So the savoriness definitely justified at their level 3 mark. And then body level 2. So I think that maybe brewing this one with the Chemex might have impacted that one, as I was drinking it not too long after I'd made the tasting wheel for one of the other coffees from the subscription box, and I said, wow, this one just has notably less body than this coffee. So for that reason, it was marked there at that level 2 mark, not necessarily the most abundant body. And then the last thing worth discussing is smokiness level 2. As I'm drinking it, I do have to say it's very subtle. It's not overly pronounced. It's not the most detectable thing there. It's not anywhere near some of the other coffees we've reviewed recently, as a matter of fact. So I wouldn't say that it's necessarily something that might impact the coffee too much. And that's why I didn't necessarily take away from the cleanliness too much, because it's there, just not necessarily the most abundant of it. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one for me was very reminiscent of what I typically experience with a lot of English coffees. And I think some people might know I did spend a month in England one time, and I just spent that entire month drinking as many coffees as I could. And I found that a lot of them were even then much more developed than something like this. But even the, we'll say, higher end and better coffees that I did have there were somewhat on par with something like this in terms of the profile of them. So every time I go back and drink coffees like this, it just reminds me of those coffees that I have had in the past. And even then, when I'm trying English coffees outside of either reviewing them or having had them from England itself, they do tend to offer the same sort of profile as well, which is just kind of interesting to me. Nonetheless, I do have to say that I enjoyed this one a little bit more than I might have expected. I wasn't sure what to expect, given that we have reviewed some English coffee roasters that have taken a much more modern approach to them. So I didn't know if this one was going to skew on the more traditional English side of things or the more modern side of things for those English coffees. But for what it was, I do have to say it was a little bit better than I might have expected going into it. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you do really like the English profile of coffees, then I feel like this one's a really good fit for you, because it does have that feel to it. In addition to that, it's very traditional. This is a lot of what you'd expect from a Guatemalan coffee. So not necessarily too much brightness, but in addition to that, a very notable dark berry aspect to it, and then traditional characteristics of that slight nuttiness, the caramel and the chocolate qualities as well, with really nice clarity, and then just that, we'll say, more traditional profile as well, kind of lending itself to towards not necessarily being the brightest coffee. But I think that's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Paya, wash processed Guatemala from Craft House Coffee. Thank you for watching.